there's a brutal truth that nobody has the courage to tell you about spiritual awakening, and it's going to completely destroy everything you believed about love. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal to you why awakened people face the cruelest paradox of human evolution. And when you understand this, your love life will never be the same again. Remember this phrase well, because it's going to make much more sense when I close the complete circle. Many people carry this completely distorted idea. They believe that the more we evolve spiritually, the fewer problems we'll face. But the truth is brutally opposite. You'll face even greater obstacles. Not because life has become more hostile, but because now you've developed the real capacity to get through them. And here comes the part that's going to sound absurd at first, but in a moment I'm going to show you exactly why this happens. One of the most shocking revelations of awakening isn't floating in perpetual ecstasy, but discovering that falling in love in the conventional way becomes practically impossible. That overwhelming rapture, that consuming anxiety, the little melodramas, and the sentimental vows, all of this starts to sound incredibly artificial. But wait, before you think this is coldness or emotional closure, I need you to understand something fundamental first. If this is already stirring something in you, if it's already making sense, hit the like button now and subscribe to the channel, because what comes next is going to explode your understanding about relationships. It's not that you've lost the ability to love, quite the contrary. Love becomes deeper, more authentic, more silent. But that old game of fantasy and pursuit simply stops operating. You can't unsee what you've already seen. And look, remember this next phrase, because it's going to echo in a completely different way when I reveal the third stage of this process later on. Now you know that much of what we call romance is just two needy egos negotiating emotional survival with each other. After you detect the trick, it becomes extremely difficult to let yourself be hypnotized again. So you find yourself there, alive, conscious, full of perception, and at the same time completely unable to fall in love the way the world has always insisted you should. Wait, stop everything now and pay attention to this. What we normally call passion is, in reality, a sophisticated form of collective hypnosis. You meet someone, and suddenly the mind starts weaving like a spider, building threads of memory, fantasy, and projection, until you're no longer relating to the real person, but to a tapestry of your own imagination. And then, completely intoxicated by your own creation, you declare with complete conviction, "I'm in love." But notice the disturbing peculiarity. Much of this love lives not from presence, but from absence. It burns more intensely when the beloved is distant, when there's uncertainty, when you're in that delicious torment of longing. It's a love that feeds on hunger, not on fullness. A sweet madness that society romanticizes as if it were the pinnacle of human experience. And if you're feeling a tightness in your chest right now, you're not alone. Thousands of people going through awakening report exactly this same disorientation, as if suddenly they were speaking a completely different language while everyone around them continues with the same automatic script. See, the ego is extraordinarily skilled at camouflaging its fundamental loneliness. It calls this passion. It dresses it up with poetic words and trembling looks. But deep down it's screaming, "I am incomplete and desperately need you to complete me." This isn't love. It's disguised emotional dependence. And as long as love is confused with neediness, it will always oscillate like a flame that only survives as long as the fuel of insecurity is constantly fed. Most of what we've been conditioned to admire as romance is precisely this, a veiled agreement, an emotional transaction. I'll calm your existential emptiness if you calm mine. That's why after the first intoxication evaporates, so many people find themselves deeply disillusioned, questioning whether they ever truly loved or just signed an invisible contract without reading the clauses. And now comes the first fundamental piece of this puzzle. Awakening is nothing mystical or supernatural. It's simply the moment when the veil falls and you see all the engineering of the performance, the self, the ego, desire, and the infinite games they execute. You realize how what you called love was constantly intertwined with the terror of being alone, with desperate longing, with massive projection. And when this recognition bursts into your consciousness, you can't fall into it as blindly as before. The spell breaks, not because you reject love, but because now you see its falsified forms for what they really are. To the awakened eye, the illusions that once passed for love no longer exert the same magnetic power. Where before you swore you had found your lost half, your cosmic complement, now you see with crystal clarity a human being with their own joys and their own shadows. The enchantment of imagining them as your savior, your completeness, begins to dissolve like morning mist in the sun. And with this penetrating vision, the old enchantment of romance no longer lifts you off the ground in the same way. What once seemed like sacred fire now seems like theatrical smoke. Desires that once seemed irresistible now appear fragile, like paper boats on an infinite ocean. The thrill of the hunt, the drama of waiting, the delicious agony of uncertainty, all of this seems slightly absurd next to the deep quietness you've experienced within yourself. It's not that you despise these things, it's that you no longer confuse them with true love. Stop for a second. Think now about a moment in your own life where you were absolutely convinced you were in love. Remember that feeling. And now, answer me with brutal honesty. How much of that was about the real person, and how much was about the story you were telling yourself? You see, once you realize that this whole thing is a kind of highly elaborate collective theater, it becomes very difficult to keep pretending it's deadly serious. Sure, you can still appreciate the performance, the laughs, the tears, the hugs, but you now recognize it as representation, not as absolute truth. Thus, what the world calls romance begins to lose its hypnotic glamour. The awakened one doesn't stop loving, but the illusions crumble like sandcastles. The game, once taken with deadly seriousness, now reveals itself as exactly that, a game. And with this recognition, you exit the collective trance and enter something infinitely more spacious. After you've tasted awakening, the entire texture of love transforms radically. You no longer carry that gnawing hunger to be completed by someone else, because you now know with absolute certainty that no one can fill you beyond yourself. You are already whole, shaped by the same life force that gave you birth. And it's precisely this wholeness that makes the old way of falling in love so profoundly difficult. Because what fueled that before wasn't fullness, but abysmal emptiness. It was the piercing pain of loneliness, the terror of not being seen that gave so much apparent fire to romance. But when you awaken, the fire doesn't burn in the same compulsive way. You're no longer chasing someone to patch the hole in your heart, because the hole has closed. And then the old drama, which once seemed so intoxicating and vital, now sounds strangely hollow. The storm that once seemed thrilling now reveals itself as unnecessary noise when you discover the oceanic calm of your own being. You also realize how much of common romance depends on voluntary blindness. The little lies we tell ourselves, the illusions we consciously embrace because the alternative seems terrifying. But awakening rips off these blindfolds without asking permission. You see with excessive clarity the unspoken agreements hidden beneath romantic vows, the ego's secret tricks, the deep fears masked as eternal devotion. And once you see, you can't unsee. Love that is rooted in the terror of being alone simply has no more fertile ground to grow in you. Let me tell you something deeply personal here. There was a moment in my own journey where I was completely lost, believing that something was fundamentally broken in me because I could no longer feel that feverish excitement that everyone around me seemed to experience naturally. I questioned whether I had become emotionally dead, disconnected from humanity, incapable of true intimacy. And then, in the moment of greatest existential despair, understanding arrived, like a silent lightning bolt piercing the darkness. It wasn't that I had lost something precious. I had gained vision, and in that transformative instant I understood with crystal clarity what seemed like devastating loss was actually supreme liberation. What felt like coldness was penetrating clarity. And this clarity, though lonely in ways I had never experienced before, was infinitely more valuable than any comforting illusion I could force myself to believe. And then, there's another truth, even harder to digest. Awakening dramatically raises your heart's standard. You no longer measure love by superficial charm, conventional beauty, or practical compatibility. Without conscious effort, you find yourself attracted to something much deeper and much rarer, a specific type of connection, an almost frightening depth, a mutual understanding that goes far beyond appearances and touches the very nuclear core of your being. And see, the available crowd becomes drastically more sparse. Where before the world was full of romantic possibilities, suddenly there are only very few people, because it's extraordinarily rare to find someone who has walked through their own darkest shadows and emerged awakened, transformed, on the other side, the vast majority are still playing the old game with total conviction. That's why it seems so impossible. Not because you can't love, but because you can no longer pretend. You can't go back to confusing neurotic need with love, emotional drama with genuine passion, anxious attachment with true devotion. You've grown beyond that, in the same inevitable way one grows beyond children's games. And although it sometimes hurts in ways you can't even articulate, although you may long for the seductive simplicity of the old intoxication, you wouldn't go back even if you could, because you know too much now. The door has closed behind you, and there's no key to reopen it. Write this down now, or pause this video to fully absorb it. When you awaken, you don't lose the ability to love, you lose the ability to delude yourself. And in a world that confuses illusion with love, this makes you seem impossible to fall in love. If you're feeling this now, if this truth is resonating in you like a bell in the deepest silence, write the word clarity in the comments. I want to know you made it this far, that you're part of the rare ones who truly understand the weight of this conscious solitude. Now, of course, all of this sounds very deep and liberating in theory. You're whole, you're free, you're awakened. You no longer confuse emotional hunger with true love. And yet, there's another face to this story that nobody mentions in the pretty spiritual books. Because when the familiar intoxications no longer move you, you don't instantly enter perpetual ecstasy, and this vacuum can be devastatingly painful. There's a deep and disturbing sense of being on the margins, as if you no longer belonged to the world through which you once moved so naturally. It's not loneliness in the usual superficial sense. You may have friends, companions, even genuine admirers. But there's a much sharper and more cutting type of isolation. The relentless recognition that very few people can meet you in the abysmal depth you now permanently inhabit. And when you try to return to the old pattern, pretend you can participate in the game like before, it sounds so false it physically hurts. You can't unknow what you know. Ignorance, once lost, cannot be recovered. And there's real fear. Visceral fear that perhaps the world will never match this new insatiable appetite for naked truth. That those who remain capable of meeting you will be devastatingly few. That you'll continue carrying your conquered fullness into environments where no one else has developed the capacity to consciously sustain such space. The loneliness here isn't the trivial absence of physical company, but the deep existential isolation of being truly understood by very few human beings on the planet. That's why it seems so impossible sometimes. Not because love has disappeared from the universe, but because your eyes are too clear to accept its falsified versions. You can't fall in love the way you used to. And sometimes this relentless clarity seems more like cosmic exile than liberating enlightenment. And here is where everything I've said so far begins to connect in a completely different way. Remember that phrase from the beginning that I asked you to remember about not being able to unsee what you've already seen. Now you understand the brutal depth of that statement. The awakened carry a silent and unwavering desire in their hearts. They would rather walk alone in naked truth than be comfortably trapped in an elaborate illusion. They won't trade their conquered peace for temporary comfort, nor will they voluntarily return to the theater of half-hearted loves and hungry emotional games, because they've seen the trick completely, the seductive brightness that dazzles for a moment, only to inevitably crumble into bitter smoke and cold ashes. The awakened one's desire is not for the old familiar fever, but for something radically simpler and rarer. If love comes, and it's a huge if, it completely shifts its center of gravity. It moves from desperately grasping to freely giving, from the exhausting melodrama of pursuit to the powerful quietness of authentic presence. It needs to come clean, without elaborate masks, without manipulative force, absolutely free, not as emotional rescue, not as anxious possession, but as the extraordinary meeting of two whole beings who consciously choose to share their conquered freedom. Anything less would be sleepwalking of the soul, and no amount of borrowed warmth is worth the brutal price of closing your eyes again and voluntarily returning to comfortable darkness. There's no neurotic attachment, only the natural joy of sharing. There are no secretly negotiated demands, but a spontaneous delight that needs no rational justification. It's a love completely stripped of manipulative theater, but filled with a spatial amplitude that the old narrow stage could never contain. This is what they deeply desire, though they rarely say it out loud for fear of seeming impossible or arrogant. Not a love that consumes and devours, but one that expands and liberates. Not a love that traps and suffocates, but one that frees and allows flight. Better the crystalline solitude of clarity than the noisy company of collective illusion. Better to wait patiently, even if it means an entire existence alone, than to cowardly surrender to the old comforting hypnosis. Because once the eyes have fully opened, peace itself is too precious to be carelessly wagered on emotional games. Because peace isn't some secondary consolation prize for those who didn't get romantic love. It is the primordial treasure itself. The oceanic quietness you discovered in the depths of your being is infinitely richer than any of the dramatic storms you once confused with passion. The old fire, all noisy sparks and dense smoke, now literally seems like child's play next to the tranquil, eternal flame that doesn't need external fuel to keep burning. And why would anyone conscious trade the constant, reliable warmth of wholeness for the intermittent, exhausting fever of chronic incompleteness? And when you live like this, with this relentless clarity, the available company becomes drastically sparse. It might take years, perhaps decades, until you meet another human being who escaped the same collective trance. Such encounters are extraordinarily rare. But then, what is a true diamond if not rare? Its radical scarcity is precisely its priceless value. So the awakened carry this sacred vow, spoken explicitly or not: better to remain alone in penetrating clarity than to kneel again before comforting shadows. Because pretending, again, returning to the old game, would fundamentally betray the precious gift that awakening has irreversibly placed in your hands. And so you wait, not in passive despair but in active patience, knowing with absolute certainty that the real encounter is rare and therefore infinitely precious. What a paradoxical and strange gift this is! At the same time a transcendent freedom and a cutting loneliness. The awakened would consciously rather face the long silence of solitude than the deafening noise of falsified loves and superficial connections. They will wait patiently for as long as necessary, even if it means an entire existence walking alone. Because this means, with absolute certainty, that when love finally comes, if it comes, it won't be born from desperate hunger, but from overflowing fullness, not from paralyzing fear, but from conquered freedom. And this specific type of love, though devastatingly rare, is literally the only love that can truly last beyond illusions and survive the test of time and naked truth. You don't desperately seek to be completed, because you know yourself to be already fundamentally whole. You don't beg for guaranteed permanence, because you've deeply learned that all things move and transform. And because there's no secret agreement, there's no invisible cage. You can stay or you can go freely, and love remains absolutely free of chains. It's not about dramatic rescue or anxious possession, but about the pure, simple joy of conscious presence. Two beings who aren't desperate halves looking for complementary halves, but already individually whole and therefore genuinely capable of sharing without paralyzing fear of loss. When you no longer need love to rescue you from your incompleteness, you're finally truly free to offer it without hidden conditions. When you no longer demand that another human being complete you as if it were their cosmic responsibility, you can meet them exactly as they are, not as projected fantasy, not as designated savior, but as an equal traveling companion in the unfathomable mystery of existence. That's why the awakened don't fall into love like an accidental fall. They consciously ascend into it. They're not dragged down by compulsive longing, but elevated into expansive freedom. And when love is no longer an emotional prison, it finally becomes what it always was at its deepest root, the purest, unfiltered expression of life itself manifesting. When you're no longer enslaved by the neurotic need to be loved in order to feel valid, you discover you're infinitely freer to love than you ever were in your entire previous life. And now, if you've made it to this exact point in the video, you're part of the very rare ones who actually absorb content of genuine depth instead of just consuming superficial entertainment. You're among the very few who don't just passively consume, but digest and transform. Subscribe to the channel now. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos in this awakening journey. And here's something critically important. Save this video to listen again in exactly 7 days. Because all this truth will make much more sense the second time. You'll perceive layers and nuances that are still settling in your consciousness now. Remember that phrase about not being able to unsee what you've already seen? On the second listen, you'll notice connections that are completely invisible now. And if you know someone who's going through this same paralyzing confusion, thinking there's something fundamentally wrong because they can no longer fall in love in the old automatic way, share this video. You might be the exact instrument of liberating understanding that this person desperately needs but doesn't know how to articulate. And if you want to continue this radical journey of awakening and relentless clarity, click on the next video that will appear here on the screen, where I delve even deeper into these invisible patterns that completely govern our lives without us noticing.